Good afternoon and welcome to the debate Ukrainian feminist responses to the Russian invasion, which is jointly organized by Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung Prague and Institute of International Relations Prague. I'm Mila O'Sullivan from the Institute, researcher from the Institute of International Relations, and I'm delighted to be chairing this debate that aims to highlight the voices of Ukrainian feminists. It is my honor to introduce four of them as our speakers today. So let me introduce Anna Dovgopol from the Kiev office of Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung. She leads the gender democracy program there. Welcome. We have with us also Oksana Potapova, a feminist researcher and peace builder, and she's also the co-founder of Theatre for Dialogue. Our next speaker is Yosh, who is the head of NGO Feminist Workshop in Lviv. And finally, let me introduce philosopher Tamara Zlobina. She is also the editor-in-chief of the online expert resource Gender in Detail. So welcome and thank you all for joining the debate as speakers, even at this extremely difficult time for you, as the Russian invasion of Ukraine has continued for 70 days. Russia has perpetrated unjustified, brutal aggression against Ukrainian people, including sexual and genocidal violence, causing enormous human suffering. We have seen the continuum.
This meeting is being recorded.
We have seen the continuum of violence on the EU soil as well, as millions have seek exile here. And against this background, we have seen a tremendous strength of Ukrainian women and their multiple agencies in resisting the aggressor. And I'm sure we'll hear a lot about that today. And on the other hand, their voices and agencies have been rarely recognized in international responses. There has been this strange silence on the side of even women, peace and security community and feminist foreign policies as well, as the international mode switched into war rhetoric. So even though it is now crucial to take women, peace and security seriously, also given that the patriarchal justification of the war was done by Russian leadership. And the lack of local feminist voices has caused some misunderstandings about the nature of the invasion, also what is being called colonial or West-blaming accounts. So I hope this debate can provide some important interventions and explanations to it from Ukrainian feminist perspective. And before we proceed to our speakers, I would like to thank also the audience, the participants for being with us, and say that you can, you're welcome to write questions to the speakers in the chat box during the debate. So let's go first to Tamara and Anna. You have been both very active from Maidan to present, and as Anna recently said, this has paid off. Women are very active and visible. So I'd like to ask if you could elaborate more on it. What does it mean being a feminist in the reality of the ongoing invasion? So if we could start with Tamara. Thank you, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you for inviting us to this discussion. Hello to everyone. I'm very glad to speak and to give some Ukrainian perspective of what is going on. And my short speech now will be rather theoretical, but with close connection to Ukrainian reality. And I think that this is really important because as I could observe, during the last 2 months, the international feminist discussion on war in Ukraine is just kind of exchange of outdated stereotypes. And these stereotypes, maybe it's not as stereotypes, maybe it's kind of analysis of previous wars that have happened before. And when it comes to Ukraine, the applicability of these attitudes are quite limited. And I'm not even talking now about the ridiculous demand of not giving weapons to Ukraine. That is completely ridiculous and like bad decision. I think that we will talk about it later. But I'm more concerned about problems that feminist movement has in analyzing the current situation and changes in what is going on. And to my opinion, this problem comes from the fact that as feminists, we look on problems that women have. So we live in patriarchal society, and women, different groups of women have a lot of different problems. We concentrate on them, we critique, and with this kind of focus, we don't see or we devaluate other important things that can influence reality. For example, we often miss to measure the agency women have, because we tend to perceive women as victims, not women as subjects, women as agents, and we also tend to devaluate certain discursive changes. And case of Ukraine, especially after the Euromaidan, is very good example how this kind of approach do not work. And I will go back for 8 years to Euromaidan event, because it's a brilliant example of how it can be mistaken if we analyze reality through these stereotypical feminist lenses. Because in Ukraine, on Euromaidan, we had very, very particular situation that was connected with the general development of Ukrainian society that emancipated in gender question, but this tendency to emancipation didn't have own discourse in the public sphere previously before 2013, because feminism as such was demonized and marginalized. So before the 2013 in Ukraine, we had women who had a demand for emancipation, who became more and more emancipated, and no public discourse about that. So on the very Euromaidan, we had very, very interesting situation when a lot of women engaged into the process as subjects, having their own agency. But the discourses about their participation were outdated. They were created at previous time, and they were sexist. And it brought some confusion, because if you analyze discourses of the Euromaidan, they are sexist, and you say, oh my God, it's so sexist, it's so ultra-right, and we would have a nightmare, a right nightmare in Ukraine after the Euromaidan. But if you concentrate on the agency of women, on what they actually did and how much of credit they got from the society, situation looked differently, because women were active participants and active makers of Euromaidan. And we saw how this contradiction developed after the Euromaidan, when women who were volunteers continued to volunteer because we had the war with Russia from 2014. And they continued to engage, they continued to change their community, and they started to talk about sexism and to talk about their own rights. And these outdated discourses started to change. And during the last 8 years, we witnessed how discourses on gender equality, on women, on feminism in Ukraine were changing step by step. And this is important to understand, that some people, some group of society can have their outdated or traditional vision of the reality. But if women are active subjects, they can change it. They can change a lot and considerably. And we saw a lot of very successful grassroots initiative, for example, initiative of women soldiers, who were engaged as volunteers in the beginning in the army. They were discriminated as women there. They started campaigns and they started to fight discrimination, and they get some significant results as a change in law and as a change in attitude. So we have problem, we have agency, we have discursive change, and we have change of the problem. It's like, it goes like in circle. So now, like having in mind this kind of theoretical approach, where we are able to recognize not only problems, but also agency of women and also discursive changes, like having this kind of approach, we can understand the Ukrainian situation more clearly, because now with the full scale of Russian war in Ukraine, Ukrainian women got like additional problem, a huge additional problem to that problems that existed before. Like it's enormous, like a lot of dramatic, very complicated problems. And we can easily get depressed if you only think about that level. But since the Euromaidan, we have this huge agency of Ukrainian women who have tendency to change reality around them, who have tendency to change laws, infrastructure, some social attitudes, and so on. And we also have this very positive discursive change in the society, because now, after the 8 years of emancipation, we don't have these outdated discourses that describe reality, or they are much more weaker than in the times in Euromaidan. And if one analyzes Ukrainian media sphere, we can see that the role of women is highlighted, that there are a lot of talks about women, and government officials, they say that we are very thankful for our men and women who are fighting for Ukrainian independence, that we are thankful to service people, for military who are fighting, and we are also thankful to volunteers who are fighting. So the vision became more relevant to the reality, and this discourse change is really very, very strong in Ukraine. So with these huge problems that we have, and I'm sure that my colleagues will describe them in detail, we have also some benefits, some advances. We have strong women agency that was developed in Ukraine during the last 8 years, and we have this discursive change towards a more emancipated manner of describing reality. So I hope that my small theoretical introduction made more clear the situation in Ukraine, our context, and I give floor to my colleague, to Anna, and I'm very interested to hear your comments and what do you think about Ukraine now?
Okay, so I take the floor. Thank you for Mila and the Institute of International Relations and Heinrich and the colleagues in Prague for actually organizing this event on Ukraine. And this is especially valuable that you, the whole process, how you organize it is very valuable. And I really want to highlight it, that and the sensitivity, your sensitivity towards Ukrainian speakers, and for asking us how we want to talk, what we want to talk about, and who would be the good counterparts. This is valuable, particularly because there are numerous other international events that are organized in a very different manner. I will stop here for this. As for the question, Tamara covered most of the things that I was actually also about to speak. So I will just touch upon one of the things that I think is a follow-up on this, and which is quite relevant also to analyze the discourse of the war. The guns always come afterwards, and Russian military aggression against Ukraine also came after the Russian immense propaganda within the country and in other countries of the world, in Ukraine and in the West. The Russian ideology, to put it very simply, of course, there are a lot of nuances to this, but in speaking about gender, Russian traditional state ideology is very much based on this idea of traditional values, quote unquote. And at the core of the traditional values lies the idea of very patriarchal system. And this is how Russia sees itself as fighting the Western world. We are different than them. We are pure because we have those traditional values. And to fight the West, the global West, meaning US and other countries, Russia takes very specific things like gender roles, and which includes homophobia, and homophobia is the state part of the state ideology, and we have seen the consequences for this and also quite a distinct role of women. You have probably heard that some time ago they changed the laws on domestic violence, which basically made it okay for men to beat their wives or their partners, and that wouldn't be a crime. So this whole idea of very conservative concept of traditional values is translated into very detrimental practices. And speaking of Ukraine, following upon what Tamara has said, that Ukraine, even though we still have a number of problems to work on emancipation of women, to deal with gender roles, starting from West, life-saving West for women soldiers. But Ukraine has gone already a lot far from these traditional values, and it is not likely that we will come back. And this move into emancipation of gender roles is something that makes us closer discursively to the West and further from Russia. And that what also irritates Russia. The whole idea of this war is for Russians are to claim that Ukrainians are the same. Ukrainians are Russians, and we are like Russians. We speak Russian or a dialect of Russian, since Ukrainian doesn't exist in the reality. And I think it is even more, it is hugely important, this shift in gender roles, this emancipation that has started and is basically ongoing. And this is, of course, a question how the setup will look after the war. We don't know this, but it is likely that we will not come back to the traditional setup. And this would basically it irritates Russia, of course, and this is also something that helps us to win this war. And I think discursively we have already won. So I will stop here and pass the floor to my colleagues.
Thank you so much, Anna and Tamara, for giving us this important context and the emancipatory tendencies since Maidan. I will now ask Yosh. You're working with feminists across the country through your feminist workshop. How has your work changed with the invasion? What are the most pressing insecurities of women and different groups of people? So, for instance, Roma community or LGBTQI+. And how do you try to deal with this or mitigate these? Thank you.
Hello to everybody. Thank you for inviting me. And I want to start with mentioning that it's a privilege to me to have this opportunity to take part in these international meetings, which I think is extremely important now. But the thing why I'm here now is because I fled Ukraine in the first day of the war, and my colleagues, almost everybody of them didn't go away, and they continue to work in the field in Lviv. So our organization, Feminist Workshop, was started in 2014, and in Lviv. Lviv is relatively safe city. It was it was before yesterday, I think, because yesterday it was bombed, and it's not so easy to my colleagues to take part in such kind of meetings, because everybody feels either anxiety, either willing to do something important to like assistant people who flees, because Lviv. Yeah, so I just explained a bit what was our activities before the war. So we are community-based organization, and our mission is to create space to help development of feminist movement, and we support first steps of young activists in their volunteer activities. And basically all our organization was doing this 8 years, it was about ideas of these young activists. And then what was happened when the war started is that we had a meeting in our office, and about 15 activists came from our network. And we was thinking that we will organize this meeting and to support each other in psychological way and to exchange our emotions. But it took maybe 15 minutes of exchanging emotions, and then everybody was started to talk that they want to help somehow, because everybody was thinking that Lviv will be the more safe region, and also Lviv is a transport spot. So basically many people who escape in dangerous regions, and they came to Lviv first, and then they can move to other cities in the western region of Ukraine or go to the Europe. And so the other important fact is that we was ran of our budget before the war, and we also was thinking about closing the organization, but because of we already had this community of activists, and everybody, and many of them, they just lost their other incomes. So we understood, and I, as a person responsible for fundraising, I understood that it's that I should fundraise more actively now, and I should support all these activities people want to do and what they want to do. And when we started to do with the starting of the war is that we organize some training on first aid, on self-defense, on other important topics. We also provide psychological support for people who flee in Ukraine or dangerous regions of Ukraine. We also provide accommodation. So in the first weeks, it was like just our activists share their apartments with people who need just stay for overnight. And now we are opening the second shelter for women and children. And also we try to continue to work with the topic of sexual violence, because reproductive health and sexual education was one of our main topics even before the war. And now we are thinking about how to connect this new I don't know how to call this dramatic events and this educational process on sexual violence, and to support those who suffer violence, not only from Russian soldier, but also from other participants of this process. to give you more reflection on how all these processes are organized in the field, I would like to say that we faced that we see much more unity now between different activists, between different groups of civil society, for example, and people are highly enthusiastic about helping each other. And they help to each other, I think, regardless ethnical profile, age, or gender, and so on. And this, I didn't see anything before, and it's something. It's huge amount of people involved in these processes of mutual aid. But then, on the other hand, the previous conflict became more harsh. It's not safe to be a feminist activist in daily life, and it was not so safe before the war because we have conservative and far right groups and who didn't agree with our approaches or how we even look like, and they continue to exist in our society. And we understand that we should be very careful in the way we are organizing our activities now. And also we see more, sometimes we see more critical approach, we face more critiques from different groups of society to what we are doing now, and because some of our even colleagues, they expect that we do not support army, for example, or some of our colleagues or friends expect that we don't work with Russian activists or speak Russian language. Some of them will expect that we will be not too emotional, because being too emotional is not so very welcomed in different international platforms. For example, to being quite emotional is not good to attend some international meetings and to take part in processes of, for example, coming up with some policies or papers. But as a feminist, we understood that emotions is an integral part of our life, and we'd rather be aware of our emotions and positions from which we are speaking than hide and pretend that we are totally calm about what's going on. And yeah, so, and if we fail some expectation of our comrades or colleagues who represent more higher levels, maybe municipal levels or governmental levels or some international structures, then we will be excluded. But when you do real work in the field from morning till the night, you can't search for better approaches, and you can't think about how to be quite good to take part on all these activities. Yeah, I think I spoke quite long now. Maybe I can continue later. So thank you.
Thank you so much for your important contribution, and let's talk more about it with Oksana. As far as I'm aware, you're conducting a gendered impact analysis of the invasion. Could you share with us some of your first findings, and perhaps tell us if you're also using the Women, Peace and Security framework for the analysis? And if you could perhaps also, I saw that you recently reflected on the need to include care as part of peace building. So if there's a space to do it currently, analysis. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mila, and greetings to Anna, Tamara, and Yosh. I think it's first time we are in this company together for a while, even virtually, and I really support my colleagues in celebrating these kind of spaces because something we noticed as well in 2014, in the beginning of conflict in Donbass, that women's rights organizations, especially on the ground, become first responders, and time for reflection, for thinking, for strategizing and advocacy somehow is delayed. And I'm really glad that it's happening in parallel right now. And I hope that the connections between the academic, the intellectual, and the grassroots will continue to be to exist, and it will not happen in separation. Because again, coming back to feminist principles, this embodiment of knowledge and the praxis of applying theory is very important. Speaking of the question that you posed to me, indeed, for the last 2 months, I have been involved as part of a team of researchers, in fact, in conducting the rapid gender assessment of the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. And I stress the word humanitarian because this research is particularly aimed at informing the work of humanitarian organizations, which is a bit more narrow than the larger women, peace and security agenda. Humanitarian aspects include more the impact on men and women in terms of services, access and resources, and a slight analysis of transformation of gender roles and the socioeconomic situation, but has a lot less focus on participation, for example, which is a really important pillar of the WPS agenda. And humanitarian reports tend to exclude or focus less on the military aspect of women's participation and civil society participation at large. And I think this kind of falls into the pillar of human security. So the data of this report, it's available online as well on the website of UN Women Ukraine. It describes a lot of vulnerabilities and structural impact that the war is already having on society. And this is where I think it's important to bring in, again, another feminist perspective, that while I fully support Tamara and Anna and Yosh in reflecting the positive discursive changes that we are observing in terms of how women are represented and the diversity of roles that we are observing, I think we as feminists must remain intersectional in our analysis and keep looking at which women have access to decision-making, which women are visible now, and which women have resources to continue being engaged. And the rapid gender assessment is showing that, of course, the war in Ukraine is having tremendous impact, both in terms of security risks, protection risks, immense displacement, which again is not accessible to everyone based on people's ability or age. In a previous discussion that happened recently, Anna also mentioned the elderly women, and I want to bring up this category particularly as it stands out in the report. Elderly women are the majority among the elderly population in Ukraine, and they are now especially vulnerable when it comes to the inability to move and relocate, or their unwillingness to do that. And the whole aspect of care related to that has to do with family members who also care for them, because I think we would agree that in Ukraine, mostly care infrastructure or the system of care is organized around extended family support. We don't have the culture or the infrastructure of care facilities, for example, as is common in the West. And I don't know if it's a good or a bad thing in terms of culture, but reflecting on that means understanding that sometimes a whole family may be limited in their mobility because a grandmother is unable to move, and things are connected that way in many intersectional ways. Also, a lot more women are becoming the main breadwinners of families. as men losing their jobs or being conscripted to the army, even though, again, the perception around conscription is a little bit generic in Ukraine. Not all men are being drawn to the army, not all men fight. However, that majority of them are men, and we are seeing the increase in this divide. And more women are becoming also leaders of the female-headed households, so single mothers, or because of displacement, families are being separated. And I think these socioeconomic and more structural issues need to be taken into account when we think about longer-term possibilities for women to be active, especially women in smaller towns, in rural areas, or the internally displaced women. In fact, prior to me engaging more in research, I was working for a few years as a civil society activist with the internally displaced women, using community theater as a tool of mobilization, but also as a participatory embodied research methodology. And these aspects of holistic security, socioeconomic security, and the aspects of care infrastructure came out very strongly as some of the immediate needs of displaced women that they were already bringing up inside Ukraine. And we are seeing this growing exponentially now that so many Ukrainian women are refugees in Europe and are facing similar needs and are needing to integrate into societies, find homes, find infrastructure, and at the same time take care of their children. And I'm aware that so very happy about the fact that research has already started around this issue by one of our colleagues, Olena Strelnik, and other feminist activists and researchers, specifically in Poland, the country that has hosted the largest number of Ukrainian refugees for now. And I hope we will see soon the results of that study and policy recommendations coming out. And it does stress for me the importance of not only looking at these aspects of immediate impact, but in terms of thinking of what society we want to build when we think about Ukraine post-war, and how inclusive of the needs of different women this society will be, not only on the level of discourse, but also in terms of structures, infrastructure, socioeconomic situation. And I think this is where, you know, kind of thinking back to the next question, we will need solidarity and cooperation with other colleagues of post-conflict contexts, but also other researchers who look or have looked into these aspects of gendered care and society as a part of holistic security. Yes, I have more things to say, but I will leave them for future interventions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all these important points. Let's move to the second part, which is more focused on the international cooperation. I think I have, as I already mentioned, there's many international calls with these that deny Ukrainian agency and also substantial silence and or hesitance apparent among international actors, including feminist actors. So I had a question for everyone, and a similar question is actually I found that is raised by Tamara Martiniuk, and welcome. Also, I'm glad we have a lot of Ukrainian feminists among the participants, in the audience. So she's asking a similar question, which is how my question is how crucial and supportive are international feminist responses for you, and how can international actors as well as feminist actors follow the lead of Ukrainian women now amid the urgent humanitarian situation, but also in a long-term perspective of Ukraine's recovery. And Tamara's similar question is, what type of solidarity do you expect? What would you like to have from international feminists? So it's quite similar. We'll answer it at the same. Let's start with Tamara. Let's give the floor to Tamara. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the questions. I suppose there can be a lot of answers to this simple question, and the most obvious one is that demanding of not giving weapons to Ukraine is really harmful. It doesn't help. It helps nothing, because in that case, Ukrainian territories would be occupied by Russian soldiers. And we all know after Irpin and Bucha what Russian soldiers do to Ukrainian population, to women, to kids. And like, it's hard for me to understand even the logic that is behind of this, like, do not give weapon to Ukraine to defend themselves. It's like really very weird. And that kind of attitude, the very possibility that this kind of attitude have appeared in the circumstances of this horrible war in the kind of Western intellectual thinking, it should be studied, because it shows us that something is going really, really wrong with intellectual discourses on the West. If it happens like this, if some huge and harmful mistake like this are proudly proclaimed by very well-known feminists like Nancy Fraser from New York State University, and so on and so forth. So that is my first answer. And my second answer for what kind of international support could be that would be really helpful in these horrible times is the first answer is about care economy, about helping Ukrainian women to care for their children in different countries of Europe where they live now. And in social media we read a lot of stories about kindergartens that work up to 4 o'clock at 4 o'clock p.m. in some countries, but the working day is till 6 or 7 o'clock p.m. and it's impossible to work if your kid is in kindergarten, because kindergarten is closed like too early. And it doesn't work, and I suppose it doesn't work for a European woman, and Ukrainian women are even more vulnerable to this because they don't have expanded networks of support. They don't have families, they don't have friends that they rely on. It's often a single a mother of few children who needs to take care about all of them and also work to support them. So this type of international support is really something that is that needs to be done, and it is very obviously feminist. And I'm surprised that international feminist organization or feminist organizations in different countries don't talk much about this. And as for Ukraine, I suppose there could be a lot of ways to change. I hope my colleagues will add another one, and I will concentrate only on this symbolic and discursive moment. And it's a moment of women leaders, because now in Ukraine we have a lack of prominent women leaders of the wartime. We have one minister, Irina Vereshchuk, and maybe one second, I don't know, zastupnik ministra, second person in the Ministry of Defense, who is also a woman. So 2 of them are visible, but all the other top politicians who are visible in media are men. And that is not good, and it should be balanced. And happily, Ukrainian media and Ukrainian society balance it by telling stories of small-scale heroism of volunteers and different people doing like different things. But on the level of agency and being able to participate in some negotiations, as women agents, they should be highlighted and supported, and that is something needed right now, that we need to have more women in doing politics and doing some public work. And maybe international organization can support Ukrainian deputies or civil society leaders and give them more credit and more symbolic capital and more influence. But it's like not last not least, and there can be a lot of other ways to help.
Thank you for your contribution. Let's give the floor to Yosh now. Thank you.
Not on. Okay. I would like to continue this refugee topic because 6 million of refugees fled Ukraine, but 36 million are still live in Ukraine, and I don't know. I know how that Ukrainian refugees are quite welcomed now in the EU, but not everywhere, and 1.5 million of Ukrainians came back home, and even liberal media writes about refugees crisis, shifting the focus from the war itself to consequences of the war for European Union. And it's quite surprising for me, like just, and I also don't like this approach to speak about the consequences of the war and about how we can rebuild and develop our country after the war will stop. While we don't have enough support with arms, and we even can't imagine when this war will stop and if we will have something to save and develop and reconstruct in our country. So that's why I'm focused more on people who continue to live in Ukraine. And I even didn't manage to convince my parents, who was sitting 2 months under the fire, to convince them to leave this city. And there are millions of such Ukrainians, and I think that it's extremely important to think about how can European solidarity can help inside of Ukraine, except of given the weapon, which is, I think, also the most important. And here at this moment, I'm facing, and my NGO is facing this issue with how these funds, European, for example, funds are located in Ukraine. And we had this problem before the war because like our community grassroots organization was never quite good to apply and receive some big money. And now this big funds, they expect that our organizations, that they have capacity to work like in the same style, with the same bureaucracy processes like before the war. And I hope that at some moment they will change their processes. And that's what I'm thinking about is if this refugee crisis will lead to the discussion about races, for example, inside of the EU, because we can speak about this racist issue, and we can shift this focus to racism inside Ukraine. And of course, there is a racism in Ukraine, but still there is a racism in the EU, and it's not appeared just now with the Ukrainian refugees. And I hope that somehow it can be changed, and somehow we can start this dialogue about changing the global policies on how to support countries with war, conflict, with funds. Because yeah, and I already mentioned that so much support and assistance is organized by volunteers, by emergent initiatives, and they even don't have registration, and it's extremely hard to be registered during the war because not every service is not working the same way just before the war it was. And I also appreciate a lot that there are crowdfunding platforms, that some groups in the Europe, they organize and give them like money with the cash and go to the board and go to Ukraine and bring this money. But that's not only, this should be done not only by self-organized activists and just regular people, but also we need to think about structural changes and changes in this philanthropy and the civil society structures.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's pass the floor to Oksana. Thank you.
Thank you. There's so much to be said. I think, speaking of my positionality, I'm also I have been outside of Ukraine since February 25th, and after some sense of confusion and guilt, as I know all of us to a certain degree experience while being in a more safe location, I saw my role as someone who is able to be in dialogue with the international community, international feminist community, and I think a lot about these questions, and I hear a lot of feedback. Also, one thing I think is important if we speak about solidarity is to recognize that Ukrainian refugees, many of them are active politically or want to be active. And what Tamara mentioned in terms of infrastructure is one aspect. Another one is that at least in some cities, hubs like Berlin and others, there is a concentration of women activists and human rights defenders who need different kinds of conditions to be able to continue their work, to set up maybe remote offices of their organizations and keep supporting Ukraine, or to be able to have assembly and self-organize and to influence politics in their countries where they live. And I think it requires also a different view on who refugees are and what they need, and also with much more agentic view, and also different politics of integration. Another aspect, I think, is I'm a women's rights and a peace activist, and you know, sometimes I wonder if still okay for me to mention the second part. You know, what does peace activists look like right now in this context? It wasn't always easy for me to be a peace activist even prior to this war since 2014. And I keep thinking about what this means now. The reason for this is that for a long time, the agenda of peace in Ukraine and even of security in Ukraine was appropriated by Russia, first of all. So the Russian narrative of peace actually included our no Ukrainian interests whatsoever. And right now the situation is even more so. So the mention of Tamara, what she mentioned of don't give us arms, we need peace, just agree to Russia's conditions, is not the kind of peace. It's not a feminist peace in my understanding, because it doesn't include the power relations and the imbalance of power relations between our states. And what I personally need and long for is spaces of critical conversation with other feminists, where we as Ukrainians can develop our own definition of what we mean by feminist peace and feminist security for Ukraine from our perspective. And then we can call for that kind of peace, but it will be on our terms. And we will not feel like other global international organizations like the OSCE or global feminist peace organizations are imposing their agenda onto us. And I think in that regard, even more importantly for us would be to have solidarity and experiences and conversations with anti-colonial and decolonial feminists from countries who are outside of Europe and outside of global North, but who have experienced similar struggles in their regions and who have reflections and experience that is as complex as ours. And here I see the gap because our region, in particular, Eastern Europe, at large and post-Soviet space, whatever this means, I know we can also problematize these definitions, is outside of, first of all, theoretical school of post-colonial and decolonial studies. And this is also where the blindness happens, because we look white. And in my understanding, a lot of decoloniality is associated with very clear racial divide. So those who need to be decolonized are usually non-white, who have been colonized by the white. And we are seen as white people because of the color of our skin, but we know that race is a structure, a structure of power. It's not just color of the skin. And structurally, Eastern Europeans, Ukrainians are not white by the definition of global North, socioeconomically, in terms of our rights, our passports. And to have that conversation with other activists and to build bonds of solidarity, first of all, with feminists from the region, from other states who are experiencing Russian imperialist policies, but also from other parts of the world who have this critical understanding, I think would give us a lot of new ideas, but also could enrich global the conversations about feminist anti-imperial struggle. And where is the role of militarism in that struggle? Where is the role of armed resistance in that struggle? Where is the role of peace in that struggle, and what that peace can look like? Yeah, I think I will stop here.
Thank you so much for all these important points raised. I would like to remind the participants, the audience, that you can still write a question in the chat in case you would have one to the speakers. And let's give the floor to Anna now. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks to my colleagues, you've covered most of the topics, and I don't have much to add. I will just underline the importance. I think the major thing that the Western feminists can do in solidarity with Ukrainian ones is basically in asking our perspective. And this principle, nothing about us without us, which comes from a bit different background, is, I think, universally applicable. I think it's very inappropriate to organize events or to make public statements or feminist texts with claiming that this is the global feminist position without inviting Ukrainian representatives of Ukrainian feminists to comment on this. I really think this is inappropriate, and I'm referring to one of the feminist statements where there is no single person from Ukraine that calls not to give arms to Ukraine just because these feminists are for peace. And this is very comfortable to call for peace when you see it in a country which is safe and which is safely protected by NATO. So you know that your country will be safe in case of Russian aggression. I think as feminists, we are in principle for peace. I don't think there are people in the world who are not for peace, but there is calling for disarmament of Ukraine is like saying that a victim of domestic violence abuse should surrender to the abuser. It's not asking the abuser to stop beating the victim who actually started this, who is stronger, but asking the victim to stop opposing and simply to surrender. And I think this is a very important thing. And also it is sensitive to. I know Ukrainian feminists don't have a single opinion on all possible questions. And this is absolutely normal. We're different people. We had discussions within the feminist community before, and we still have, and that's quite okay. But it's still wise to invite at least several people and ask them what they think. And one more thing, which, and this refers to one of the questions in the chat, if we have some contacts with Russian feminists. Well, personally, I don't. I have personal contacts with activists from Russia, but these are my long-term contacts and my personal contacts. But systematically, this is quite a problematic thing. And this is a quite debatable thing that often comes in the discussions now and then, that we as, for people who participate in these international discussions, often organized by Western feminists. And personally, I'm very grateful to Western, to people outside of Ukraine who organize these events. We don't often have capacity and resources now and energy for this, but organizing the event and putting on the panel Ukrainian, Russian, and Belarus people, feminists, I don't know, people from other spheres saying like, well, now you have a peace talk. This is like putting at the same table an abuser and a victim and saying, now you have a peace talk. And I think that this is absolutely inappropriate. And given the comments after that, that you are not sensitive enough, that you are nationalist, and that you're that if we refuse to speak at the events where there are panelists from Russia, would be like is often blamed as that we are concentrating very much on nationality, while the problem is that this war that Russia wages on Ukraine is based on nationality. It is just the war, just the war on us as Ukrainians, and so we cannot ignore this fact. This is all.
If I can, I have one comment, but it's important to add, and it's about this peace talk that is common in the West. Let's make peace for any expense and so on. And it's actually curious to see how people, I don't know, forgot what reality is, because the war does not end by peace. The war ends by victory. Like only after victory of one party, there could be peace. Of course, there can be negotiation and some peaceful treaty, but if there is a war, if there is a conflict, there always will be someone defeated and someone who is winner. And now I see that this is a huge blind spot for the whole intellectual community on the West, that's only say we want peace, let's make peace. But you know, you need to end the war by someone defeating someone. It's a very bad thing, but it's the war. War is like that. There is always a winner, and it's really depend on the quality of peace depends on who will be the winner. Like just imagine that the peace in Europe was created after the Nazi Germany won the war. It also would be peace, but it would be a certain peace with concentration camps, with killed Jews and so on and so forth. And now in Ukraine, we are in the very same situation. If this war will end by the even partial win by Russia, like Russia will occupy Kherson and will stay there, the result will be concentration camps for Ukrainians. Like this is the result. This would be the condition of peace in Ukraine, is concentration camps for Ukrainians. And this is something that we should be really strongly aware of.
Thank you so much, Tamara.
If I may, I also want to bring up an aspect of resistance, which doesn't come up a lot in these in discussions as well, and how to stop the war, how to bring peace. We seem to fall in these two binaries of either, you know, we ask for weapons, which I support as well, or we go to these, you know, sit down and talk. I read an article by Oksana Potapova recently from Spilne magazine. I tried to post it as well, and I really liked her materialistic analysis of war coming from coming from the left perspective, where she explains the call for sanctions and for block of embargo on trade with Russia as a country is a very pragmatic approach to cutting off ties, to economic supplies of reproduction of war. Even though there are discourses in the West as well about not all Russians being supportive and we shouldn't punish them with sanctions. I think we need to keep calling for that, both on the level of economic sanctions as well as embargo on trade with Russia. But we should not see this as a punishment, because I think punishment should be done in court. And I really hope that another aspect of this piece will be justice, and that all the war crimes will be taken to court, including, of course, sexual crimes. But when we look at the economy of this war, which is perpetrated again by economic ties, we seem to forget about the economic and political economic analysis of the global arms trade, which has been happening since 2014 between France and Germany and Russia, countries that have been there helping Ukraine to negotiate the Minsk agreements. I mean, it's mind-blowing if you think about it. And that is a feminist agenda where we can all unite, I think, where we can make these connections visible, we can challenge them, and we can also look at how this is impacting wars. And another aspect, which again, unfortunately, I don't see enough, but I think it's crucial, is the environmental aspect. This is a war built on money from trading oil. Can we just talk seriously about the need to transition to alternative sources of energy, and then we will really weaken the economies of superpowers that have built their regimes on oil trade. Those things are so connected, not only from the environmental perspective, but from the perspective of global security. And I really wish that more environmental feminist, eco-feminist activists would be with us in conversations about long-term peace for our region and globally as well, because Russia is not the only country who is using their oil money for militarization and imperialism. Thank you.
Yes, sir. We can't hear you. Sorry. Thank you, Oksana. Would any of your speakers like to respond to what has been said before we go to questions from the audience? Can we hear? Can you hear me? Yeah. Yes. Okay. Okay. So let's take some questions. There has been question concerning. There has been many comments on what has been said, also about the women leadership. Some would say, and we see it a lot here in the news in Central Europe. We see mostly men who lead the war, and then we see women, for instance, trying to bring attention to sexual violence. But the main message is that men are leading the war. Would you like to comment on it? Perhaps also there has been a huge decrease in women's participation in the local councils since the last elections. Would you like to perhaps comment on this? What has been also raised by the historian Oksana Kis about the women leadership?
Is it a question to all of us or anyone
Yes,
in particular?
Yes. If any of you would like to comment on this.
I can bring in the data that also came out in the rapid gender assessment. So happy to know that the second report has come out as we speak, and someone already posted it in the chat. So from the interviews with civil society as well as women in communities, what we are seeing now is that it's true that the volunteer efforts are unprecedented, and in terms of decision making about resources on humanitarian assistance or services, women are leading this response, but it's an informal structure which may not solidify or remain after the crisis dissipates. And on formal decision-making structures, often civil society activists mention that the decision-making process has become more centralized and more rapid for obvious reasons, and some treat it with a lot of understanding. However, they note as well that because of this, the decisions made about communities and resources in communities are less inclusive. They don't take perspectives and the needs of diverse intersectional groups of communities. There is no public consultations going on. We have structures of participatory democracy in place on the local level, and they are not operational right now. And I think we need to be on the lookout for this, reminding ourselves that maybe this can be justified in the time of crisis, but we should not let it slide. And when the active phase of the war is over, and we need to at least rebuild to what things were before, and to make sure that one other thing that we noticed in during Maidan, as well as during the war in the eastern of Ukraine, is a sort of legitimization of some political actors to a more degree than others through participation in warfare. It's kind of childish, but it can be used sometimes to say, well, you were never at the front, you never defended our country with your bodies and your lives, so what do you have to say about the future of Ukraine? And unfortunately, these kind of things keep coming up, and I fear, or I hope, that they won't become an issue or one of the barriers for justifying, for example, exclusion of women who do participate in armed response, but not in such big numbers, and that it wouldn't be the main criteria to say, because I was fighting, then I can, make decisions, because that's the logic. Then those who left Ukraine have nothing to say at all, shouldn't be speaking at all, like myself, and of course, I hope that won't be the case, but just, I hope you understand what I mean. And those tendencies are important to catch now, and also to think about a longer term future responses for us as feminists.
Thank you so much. Anybody, any other comments on this from the speakers?
Not on this, but we have more questions in the chat. Maybe we can tackle them.
There was an early question from Annick Wibben. She asked about, let me try and go back to it, that concerns
while you're reading, there was the question what we can do with rape and other sexualized crimes, gendered war crimes. I'm afraid we can do nothing at the moment, because this crime are committed by the people who have physically more power, direct power, guns, weapons, rock bombs, I don't know, who can commit this. Otherwise, of course, the Ukrainian side would not let this happen. So I don't know how to answer your question, and maybe the person who asked this question can suggest any answers. The question is what we do afterwards. And as my colleagues have already mentioned, we don't need just peace, we need we need justice, and we need prosecution. And this is the question to probably the global community, how thoroughly these things will be prosecuted. I know that in Ukraine, people are doing a lot of, the prosecutors are doing a lot already to document the cases of rape that they can document. And they are starting the court, they're opening the cases. But I mean, this is as much as we can do here in Ukraine, because we don't have any possibility to any impact on this. So I just think this is what we can do. We can what the feminist community, the global community can do, especially those who have access to media in their countries, is to speak about this. And this is one of the calls. I think in this situation, we cannot be speaking only as feminists. We are, I think here we are first of all Ukrainians. Just because this is the war against us as Ukrainians, and this is our, at least for me, this is my one of my primary identities now, which has not been for a long time in peaceful times. But there is still a lot of global support to Russians in the world. And this is outrageous. And I think what feminists in other countries can do, they can raise awareness and they can say like, this is, and sexualized crimes, rape and other, we will have, in 9 months, we will soon have young teenage girls who will give birth to babies because a lot of them don't make decisions for themselves, and their parents don't let them have abortions because there is this stereotype that if you have abortion when you're first pregnant, you will not be able to have kids. Doctors say that this is bullshit, but I mean, the parents make decisions for their children. So there will be a huge number of women who will have unwanted children. And this is the thing, one of the problems that we will have to deal with. So that would be very useful if Western feminists would speak about this kind of war crimes by the Russian soldiers. And the Russian soldiers are not forced by Putin to do this. If the argument is it's just on the Putin's war and there is nothing that the soldiers can do.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Any more comments on this, on the gender-based violence and the sexual violence and the possibility of?
Yeah, I can add because as I mentioned, this one of sexual violence and this one of our main topics. And yes, we had a huge number of media requests regarding sexual violence, and that's another part of this problem with this media coverage and with this unsensitive media approaches, because everybody just want to have testimonies of those who suffered violence, and they not so sensitive about taking care of these people. And we have information that we have 400 calls at hotline with testimonies of sexual violence, but no one of them want to go to the policy and to start some procedures to deal with this. And it is understandable, and it is because we have some social pressure on victims and on because we have this culture of violence, and it is extremely hard to challenge this sexual violence culture inside of the country when it seems like just in order to protect and to defend our country, we have to make this we have to make sensation of this episodes of sexual violence from Russian soldiers, just like we didn't have before any sexual violence and domestic violence in our families. And yeah, it's we don't feel ourselves comfortable to speak about domestic violence and to speak about this kind of violence which came because of post-traumatic syndrome of soldiers, for example, who come back home, because we feel like, and I'm saying from the perspective of feminist activists, I and many of my colleagues feel like we should support our army, because if we support our army, then we will stop the war sooner. And in these circumstances, this is extremely hard to speak about this general problem with sexual violence. And what we are trying to do with this in this particular moment is that there are initiatives from feminists in Europe who collecting products, for example, contraception, morning after pills, and some hygiene products, because also it is quite difficult to find the hygiene products for women who internally displaced or who just in the way of searching a new home. And yeah, there are some initiatives for collecting these products, and we are now making informational materials about how to use properly all these morning after pills and contraception, because in Ukraine it's not a very common thing, for example, to use condoms when you have a family and you have husband. Yeah, and another issue that so as we supposed to support our army, and often this army are men, then some women can think that it is obligatory for them to support this man with providing sexual services. Let's to say, so it's obligatory to have sexual intercourse with your husband or your boyfriend and so on. And we also try to challenge this culture and to support women that it is not your obligation, and so to put some words in these materials about saying that they are not victims. Maybe if they suffered, that can and should search for support, and there are some structures who can provide psychological support or medical support in case of rape. Yeah, so it will be good if this topic, high sensational topics of sexual violence, will lead to more general activities to fight sexual violence and the culture of sexual violence. Yeah.
Thank you. Any more comments from Anna or Oksana, Tamara on this topic? Otherwise, we can take another question. We still have time. There's a question that I mentioned earlier by Annie Ruben, and she's asking about here she hears that there's a difference between organizing as women, organizing for women's rights, and doing feminist organizing. If you could comment on that. So there's a difference between women's organizing as women, organizing for women's rights, and doing feminist organizing.
I can probably try answering this question. I'm not sure if I understand it well enough. Maybe my colleagues can follow. But organizing as women means that women can organize for whatever issues. They can organize for, I don't know, for political parties or for whatever. And organizing for women's rights, it doesn't mean who organizes, but that's about the issue that you organize about. And of course, not all of this, not all of the participants can be women. So the March 8th demonstration would be a feminist organization which is organized by the feminists. This is, I think, the short answer to the question.
I think I have a comment as well, if that's okay. I just looked at my notes and realized that I have some bullet points that exactly relate to that. I think it's important to keep mentioning this difference. And in Ukraine, over the last few years, the discussion also became more evident, especially that more programs on supporting women's rights organizations declare feminist principles. And so we start talking about whether this group or this project is a feminist one, or it's just a women's project for women, like women coming together and baking bread and talking. Is it a feminist, or is it just women and for women? And again, it's a contextual discussion, but I think if we look at the foundation of what, for me at least, feminism is from a personal and theoretical perspective, there are a few principles that sort of are cross-cutting. And if we look at how we apply our analysis and our planning and our programming, we can look at these principles, or I at least try to look at them. And one of them is to remember about power analysis. Always, for me, it's a first feminist principle. And that's why, even though I wasn't supporting militarization of Ukraine until February 2022 for various reasons, now I do, because for me, it's a logical thing to do in the current power situation, power relations. We look at transformations, not only at balancing things out or leveling out the participation of men and women, but we look at transformations and their connections to structures. So in any situation, again, this is why I talked about socioeconomic impacts and infrastructure. Those are structural things. Unless they change, then our positive examples will remain individual. I think intersectionality, which has become kind of a token word, but if we keep remembering about the perspectives, the needs of women with different vulnerabilities in our work and in our analysis, only then I think we can really talk about profound change for all women. And it's connected very much to positionality of knowledge, and the fact that 4 of us here speaking English to an international audience and doing research may know something about Ukraine, but not everything. And women in villages or in, those are just coming out of bomb shelters in Mariupol know things about this war that we don't and we never will. And that knowledge is vital for planning and looking forward. And again, and the final one is agency, which is something we started with. All of these principles, I really want to stress them because I know we spoke with some of our colleagues before that it feels like we have prepared for this all our lives, or at least for the last 8 years, because we already saw the first iteration of an armed conflict breaking out in Ukraine, a flood of international organizations and governments wanting to support us, bringing with themselves their own conditionalities, bureaucracies, reproducing structural violence and biased perceptions of us. And I know this will happen again, probably in a much bigger scale, in terms of budgets and in terms of desire to put their flag on, the future of Ukrainian democracy. I want this cooperation and the future of whatever the Ukrainian rebuilding would be like to be feminist, regardless of what we are doing. Is it farmers rebuilding their farming, or it's building cities, or it's building hospitals? Can we take into account those principles of intersectionality, agency, positionality of knowledge, and transformative change? And for that, we need local knowledge. We spoke very little about civil society's role in this, and I think it's important. One of the things I advocate is whatever money you are bringing to Ukraine, bring it directly to local actors, partner with them, ask them what they need and how they see the situation. Don't circumvent them by just partnering with bigger NGOs. They will always have resources. The local actors need support, and support to them for the last 8 years has really paid off. We need to remember that.
Okay, thank you so much, Oksana. We are running out of time, so if one of you would like to make the last comment, or who give you last 1 or 2 comments on this before we close the debate.
maybe I will add a bit, because there was a discussion going on in the chat and I really like it. I thank you very much for the active participation and asking questions and writing your comments. And I want to highlight some part of the discussions that was going on, that Ukrainian feminists as representatives of other nations that were colonized should unite to create the colonial discourse, because if the colonial discourse is created by the representatives of nation who colonized, actually the word is some wrong way to do, and our knowledge and our agency is more valuable, and we need to unite to create some attitudes and discourses and talk about it. It's the first one. And the second one, I want to ask also international audience that is here with us, like, please stop doing events about Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus, or for Ukrainian, Russian, and Belarus feminists, because it can look like some logical thing to do for some Western gays, like these three countries are in a conflict, so, but all feminists in all countries are against, so let's put them together. But it's really very wrong way to do, because Russia and Belarus are totalitarian state, a dictatorship where they dictators rule for 20 years already. Both of them rule for more than 20 years. And Ukraine is democratic state with abundant civil society. And our social contexts are so different that there are like no real value in a common discussion about Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, because our even though we would not have the war, like even we forgot about the war, it's really very wrong thing to put Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia into the one box, because two countries are dictatorships and one country is democratic state with huge advances, like for example any talk about LGBT rights is explicitly prohibited in Belarus and in Russia, and in Ukraine we have like numerous LGBT prides in Ukrainian cities like every year. Like it's a huge difference in context, and that's why we have very different problems. As feminists, we have very different situations, and it's much more better to talk about Russia and Belarus separately, and to talk about Ukraine and maybe other countries of Eastern Europe together, because the contexts are closer and it will make much more sense.
Thank you so much. I think we now really have to wrap it up, because we are running out of time already. So I would like to thank you to our speakers, to Anna Dovgopol, Oksana Potapova, Yosh and Tamara Zlobina. Thank you so much for providing us directly with Ukrainian feminist perspectives and incredible stories that you've shared with us. I hope we'll be able to continue these conversations, and especially those that you have mentioned also in the chat about the colonial nature of the war, and you mentioned the care economy, socioeconomic rights, also the transformation of our relations. So they're all really important points. So thank you once again, and thank you to the organizers and the audience as well. And thank you, and stay all safe. Bye-bye.